Two queens, one throne, one executioner's axe. This isn't just a tale of rivalry. It's the story of the ultimate historical choice, where blood ties were sacrificed to secure the survival of a crown. One was a cunning, unmarried ruler, the other an emotional, tragic queen. When blood, religion, and dynastic claim collide in a fatal struggle, how does history deliver its most devastating verdict? Welcome to the most thrilling Game of Thrones in British history. The loom of fate, imagine a chessboard spanning two kingdoms, where the only pieces that truly mattered were two women cousins, separated by less than 100 miles of borderland, yet divided by an ocean of theological difference, political ambition, and raw inherited paranoia. Their conflict was not merely a royal rivalry. It was the ultimate high-stakes drama that defined the British Isles for over 3 decades, a chilling, suspenseful, and astonishing struggle for survival and supremacy. The year is 1587. One queen, cloistered in her palace in London, sits triumphant, her reign cemented by 40 years of shrewd governance and ruthless intelligence gathering. The other queen, captive for nearly 2 decades in the cold heart of England, awaits the executioner's block. This stark ending, the beheading of an anointed monarch by her cousin, was the shocking climax of a Game of Thrones far more intricate and devastating than any fiction. How did it come to this? The story begins in the dark shadow of Henry VIII, a king whose desperate need for a male heir shattered the foundations of English society, ripping the Church of Rome from the island and creating a succession crisis so volatile it would ultimately put 2 women, Elizabeth Tudor and Mary Stuart, in a deadly, inescapable collision course. The Tudor dynasty, for all its power, was a house built on sand. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left a fragile lineage, a boy king, Edward VI, who died young, followed by the tragic Catholic queen, Mary I, Bloody Mary, who died childless. The throne passed to Henry's second daughter, the quick-witted, fiercely Protestant Elizabeth. Yet, lurking across the border in Scotland and often in France, was a direct and dangerous rival, Mary Stuart. Mary's claim to the English throne was, by many accounts, stronger in the eyes of Catholic Europe. While Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was deemed a heretic and their marriage annulled, Mary was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. Her lineage was untainted by the messy divorces and religious upheavals that haunted Elizabeth's claim. The simple fact was that to every Catholic in Europe, and to a significant, dangerous number of English nobles, Mary, Queen of Scots, was the rightful Queen of England. This was the core, astonishing truth of their relationship. From the moment Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, Mary represented an existential threat. She was not a distant relative sending pleasantries. She was a live, ticking bomb planted at the heart of the English state. Chapter 1. The Child Queen and the Bastard Princess. The lives of the 2 queens were spectacularly mismatched from birth. Elizabeth Tudor had a childhood defined by insecurity and trauma. Born in 1533, she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who was executed when Elizabeth was just 2. She was declared illegitimate, banished from court, and survived her teenage years through sheer force of intellect and a cautious silence that became her trademark. She was a scholar, a survivor, and a pragmatist forged in the harsh crucible of English dynastic politics. Meanwhile, Mary Stuart lived a fairy tale. Born in 1542, she became Queen of Scotland before she was a week old, after her father, James V, died. At the tender age of 5, she was spirited away from the brutal Scottish nobles, the rough wooing by England, and sent to France, the wealthiest, most culturally brilliant court in Europe. Imagine the French court of the Valois, lavish, sophisticated, and Catholic to its core. Mary was raised not just as a queen, but as a future queen consort of France. She was tall, famously beautiful, witty, and exceptionally graceful. She mastered 6 languages, wrote poetry, played the lute, and was beloved by all. In 1558, she married the Dauphin, Francis. The following year, when Francis became King Francis II, Mary was Queen Consort of France and Queen Regent of Scotland. This was Mary's apogee. At the age of 16, she wore the crowns of 2 of the most powerful nations in Europe. and critically she adopted a third, the Royal Coat of Arms of England. This audacious act was no mere youthful indiscretion. Instigated by her powerful in-laws, the Guise family, Mary formally claimed the English throne. For Elizabeth, who had just ascended a tenuous throne built on the shaky ground of Protestantism, this was an open declaration of war. It was the moment the rivalry transitioned from potential threat to palpable danger. Elizabeth never forgave it. The image of the French-backed, Catholic, beautiful Mary laying claim to her crown became a permanent scar on the English queen's psyche. The contrast was stark. Elizabeth, the pragmatic, intellectual, red-haired survivor of a traumatic English court. Mary, the dazzling, emotional, dark-haired darling of the French Renaissance. One a Protestant champion, the other a Catholic icon. Fate had set the stage for a personal drama that would tear apart two nations. Chapter 2. The Return of the Scottish Queen. The gilded life Mary Stuart enjoyed in France was brutally short-lived. In 1560, her young husband, Francis II, died after a brief, brutal illness. Suddenly, Mary was a 19-year-old widow, stripped of her position as Queen of France. She was now merely the Queen of Scotland, a country she barely remembered, a land renowned for its wildness, poverty, and ferocious religious turmoil. In 1561, Mary sailed back to Scotland. She left the sun-drenched Catholic elegance of Paris and landed in the harsh, fog-bound port of Leith. Her reception was shocking. The Scottish Reformation, led by the fiery, uncompromising John Knox, had swept the country. Knox openly denounced female rule, the monstrous regiment of women, and viewed Mary, the Catholic French-raised queen, as an agent of the Antichrist. Mary faced an impossible task. She was a Catholic trying to rule a Protestant nation whose populace and nobility were suspicious, recalcitrant, and armed. Her survival depended on a delicate balance: respect the Protestant settlement while maintaining her personal faith, and most importantly, placate the powerful, nearby cousin who governed England. Elizabeth watched Mary's return with hawk-like precision. Her chief advisor, the brilliant and perpetually cautious William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, urged Elizabeth to keep Mary contained. Their correspondence began as a polite but tense dance. Elizabeth refused to formally recognize Mary as her heir, a concession Mary desperately sought to ensure her security. Mary, in turn, refused to renounce her claim to the English throne. The core conflict remained frozen. Two monarchs who could not trust each other, bound by blood, separated by a crown. This stalemate forced Mary into a dangerous and ultimately tragic path: marriage. To secure her kingdom and her position, Mary needed a powerful husband who could enforce her will and perhaps even win over the English. Her choices, however, were disastrous. Elizabeth, meanwhile, played a brilliant, cynical game. She offered Mary her own favorite, the charming and ambitious Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. This was a classic piece of Tudor diplomacy, a poisoned gift. If Mary accepted, she would be married to an Englishman loyal to Elizabeth, thus neutering her threat. If she refused, Elizabeth could accuse Mary of looking for a foreign, hostile power, a reasonable charge, as Europe's great Catholic powers were eager to claim Mary's hand. Mary refused, seeing the trap for what it was. Instead, in 1565, Mary made the choice that sealed her fate. She married her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was handsome, a Catholic, and crucially, he also had a strong claim to the English throne. The marriage was, politically, a statement. Mary was cementing a powerful, combined claim to the English crown, backed by continental Catholicism. For Elizabeth, this was an act of aggression. For Mary, it was a spectacular miscalculation. Darnley was not a partner. He was an arrogant, spoiled, and drunken brute. He demanded the crown matrimonial, the equal authority, and, when refused, descended into bitterness, paranoia, and violence, setting the stage for one of history's most shocking and sensational crimes. Chapter 3. Blood, Scandal, and the Flight to England. Mary's disastrous marriage to Lord Darnley rapidly destabilized Scotland and shattered her personal authority. Darnley, petulant and demanding, grew jealous of Mary's reliance on her private secretary, David Rizzio, an Italian courtier. Convinced Rizzio was usurping his influence, and perhaps more, Darnley entered into a dark pact with Protestant lords, determined to undermine Mary's Catholic influence. The scene that followed, in the small dining room at Holyrood Palace on a cold night in March 1566, was one of astonishing brutality that shocked all of Europe. A pregnant Mary was dining when Darnley and his conspirators burst into the room. Rizzio clung to the Queen's skirts for protection, but they dragged him out, stabbing him 56 times, leaving a pool of blood on the floorboards as a horrific message to the Queen. Mary, witnessing this act of raw terror and betrayal orchestrated by her own husband, rose to the occasion with a cold fury. She manipulated Darnley, turning him against his co-conspirators and helping them escape the ensuing retribution. This moment demonstrated Mary's political acumen when cornered, but the trust and any chance of a stable royal marriage was obliterated. A few months later, in June 1566, she gave birth to a son, James. This birth was crucial. It provided both kingdoms with a male, legitimate joint heir, a fragile hope for future peace. But the peace was not to be found in the present. Mary, now estranged from Darnley, found herself increasingly close to James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a powerful and fiercely ambitious Protestant nobleman who remained loyal to her. Bothwell was everything Darnley was not: decisive, strong, and a proven military commander. The relationship blossomed under circumstances that were both politically necessary and deeply, perhaps recklessly, passionate. Then came the second and far greater scandal. In February 1567, Darnley was recovering from an illness at a house called Kirklefield, just outside Edinburgh. In the dead of night, the house was blown apart by gunpowder. Darnley's body, however, was found strangled in a nearby orchard, suggesting he was murdered before the explosion. The murder instantly implicated Mary. Though Bothwell was the primary suspect, he was tried and swiftly acquitted in a rigged process. The public, already suspicious of Mary's Catholic leanings and growing affection for Bothwell, was appalled. Their suspicions turned to absolute outrage when, only 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary married Bothwell. This act, the marriage of a queen to the chief suspect in her husband's murder, was Mary's fatal error. It was a staggering political blunder rooted either in overwhelming passion, brutal political necessity — Bothwell may have coerced her — or a deep lack of judgment. To the Scottish lords, who saw their queen compromised and their country shamed, it was the final provocation. The Protestant nobles rose up, not against her crown, but against her person. Mary was defeated at the Battle of Carberry Hill and imprisoned in Lochleven Castle, where, facing immense pressure and threats to her life, she was forced to sign an act of abdication in favor of her infant son, James VI. Her dramatic downfall was complete, but Mary was not one to yield. In 1568, she orchestrated a daring escape from the island castle. She gathered a small army, but was defeated again at the Battle of Langside. Now utterly broken and fearing for her life from her own countrymen, Mary made a fateful decision. She fled south, crossing the Solway Firth, and sought refuge in the kingdom of her cousin, Elizabeth I. Chapter 4. The Golden Cage, Mary's arrival in England in May 1568, presented Elizabeth with the single greatest crisis of her reign. The political paradox was agonizing. If Elizabeth helped Mary, she risked reigniting Catholic uprisings in England and facing a Scottish queen who might claim the English throne once restored. If Elizabeth expelled Mary, Mary would likely seek military aid from the Catholic superpowers of France and Spain, who would certainly use her as a puppet to invade England. If Elizabeth executed Mary, she would be setting a terrifying precedent for the regicide of an anointed monarch, enraging Catholic Europe, and possibly triggering a holy war against England. Elizabeth's solution was characteristic of her shrewd, cautious, and often infuriating style of governance: captivity. Mary would be kept alive but securely locked away, transforming her from a military threat into a political bargaining chip. Thus began the 19-year nightmare of Mary's imprisonment. She was held in a succession of dreary, cold castles and manor houses in the English Midlands, far from London. She was never officially charged, yet never freed. Elizabeth refused to meet her, understanding that a personal encounter with her glamorous, charismatic rival could only lead to trouble. Mary, despite her captivity, remained a queen in every sense. She maintained a large staff, pursued her hobbies, and, most critically, became the focus of every Catholic plot against the English throne. The longer she remained in England, the more dangerous she became. Elizabeth's spy master, the austere and brilliant Sir Francis Walsingham, took on the obsessive task of monitoring Mary. Walsingham was a Puritan fanatic, convinced that the survival of England and the Protestant faith depended on Mary's destruction. He created a sophisticated surveillance network using codes, ciphers, double agents, and the latest technology in ink and hidden messages. The English public was increasingly polarized. To English Catholics, Mary was a martyr queen, unjustly imprisoned by a heretic usurper. To Protestants, Mary was the Jezebel who had murdered her husband and was now actively plotting to overthrow their beloved Elizabeth. Chapter 5. The Web of Treason. The English nobility, weary of Elizabeth's refusal to marry and name an heir, provided fertile ground for conspiracy. Plot after plot unfolded, all centered on freeing Mary, murdering Elizabeth, and placing the Catholic queen on the English throne. The most famous of these early conspiracies was the Ridolfi Plot, 1571, involving an Italian banker and high-ranking English nobles. The plan was staggering in its ambition: a Spanish invasion, a Catholic rebellion, Elizabeth's assassination, and Mary's marriage to the Duke of Norfolk, England's premier peer. Walsingham and Cecil, however, were masters of intelligence. They uncovered the plot, exposed the conspirators, and executed Norfolk. These plots, though foiled, hardened Elizabeth's resolve and intensified the pressure to execute Mary. Yet Elizabeth held back. She had a profound, almost mystical belief in the sanctity of royal blood. To execute Mary would be to commit a monstrous act that could be used against her or her successors. Mary, however, was not content to sit idle. Confined, she fought back with the only weapons she had left: her mind and her correspondence. She used the complexity of her imprisonment, the sheer number of her staff, and the greed of her jailers to establish secret communication lines with her allies in Europe, perpetually fueling the conspiracies. Walsingham needed proof, irrefutable, concrete evidence that Mary herself was directly complicit in planning Elizabeth's death. Not just talking about it, but authorizing it. He knew that only the most dramatic and shocking evidence would move Elizabeth to act. In 1586, Walsingham set his ultimate trap, a sting operation of breathtaking historical consequence: the Babington Plot. A young Catholic nobleman, Anthony Babington, began corresponding with Mary, outlining a detailed plan to assassinate Elizabeth and install Mary as queen. Walsingham's agents were everywhere. They used a double agent, Gilbert Gifford, who handled Mary's coded correspondence. They employed a cipher expert, Thomas Philipse, to painstakingly decrypt every message. The letters passed through a hollow stopper in a beer barrel into Mary's prison, Chartley Hall. In July 1586, Mary, perhaps blinded by desperation and the nearness of freedom, wrote a fateful reply. She endorsed the plot, specifically approving those 6 gentlemen who were to dispatch the usurper. Walsingham's cipher expert, Philippes, added a small triumphant drawing of a gallows to the decrypted transcript and rushed the letter to London. The moment Walsingham had waited 19 years for had arrived. He finally had Mary's own words, in her own hand, authorizing the murder of Elizabeth. The astonishment was not that Mary plotted, but that she was so easily duped into providing the fatal proof. The game was over. The trap had sprung. Chapter 6. The Trial of an Anointed Queen. The discovery of Mary's complicity in the Babington Plot. Secured by the meticulous work of Sir Francis Walsingham, was the smoking gun Elizabeth's ministers had craved for 2 decades. Mary was immediately moved to the forbidding Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, the site chosen for her final act. In October 1586, the spectacle of the ages began, the trial of a crowned anointed sovereign for treason against another. 36 English noblemen, privy councillors, and judges were appointed as commissioners. Mary was allowed no legal counsel, and her access to the evidence was restricted, a fact she fiercely protested. The proceedings were held in the great chamber of the castle. The sight was extraordinary. An empty chair draped in velvet sat elevated, representing the absent Elizabeth IV, demonstrating that the English queen was the ultimate authority. Mary, seated in a subordinate chair, was to be tried as a subject, not a peer. Mary, however, proved to be an adversary of astonishing intelligence and courage. Though frail from years of confinement, she fought her accusers with a mastery of law and rhetoric that stunned the court. Her defense rested on two brilliant, unassailable points: sovereign immunity. She was not an English subject, but an independent Queen of Scotland. Treason could only be committed against her own sovereign, which was not Elizabeth. The jus regium, divine right of kings. As an anointed queen, she was answerable only to God, not to any earthly court. To judge her was to commit heresy against the principles of monarchy itself. Mary did not deny corresponding with Babington, but she masterfully claimed that while she sought freedom, she never approved the regicide, the killing of the Queen. She famously declared, "The theater of the world is wider than the kingdom of England," appealing to the judgment of history and all of Catholic Europe. Despite her eloquent defense, the political imperative was too great. On October 25, 1586, the Commission unanimously found Mary guilty of compassing and imagining Elizabeth's death. The sentence was death. The execution of a queen was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a verdict waiting only for a signature. Chapter 7. The agony of the signature. The ball was now entirely in Elizabeth's court, and she entered a period of agonizing, protracted indecision that was highly characteristic of her rule. For Elizabeth, the dilemma was profound, rooted in her deepest beliefs about monarchy, the practical threat. Her entire council and parliament, including her lifelong trusted advisor William Cecil, begged her to sign the warrant. They argued that Mary, alive, was a magnet for Spain and a direct threat to the Protestant realm. They presented the execution as a matter of national security. The sacred precedent. Elizabeth fundamentally believed in the divine, sacred nature of a monarch. To sign the death warrant of a fellow anointed sovereign, her own cousin, was to set a horrifying precedent. She foresaw the day when her own subjects might use this precedent against her. For 3 months, Elizabeth wavered, crying, ranting, and postponing the decision. She even subtly urged Mary's jailer, Sir Amyas Paulet, to do the deed privately to save her the blood guilt, but the staunchly Puritan Paulet flatly refused, stating he would not shed blood without law or warrant. Elizabeth was forced to face the decision herself. Finally, in February 1587, under immense pressure, Elizabeth signed the warrant, trusting it to her junior secretary, William Davison. What happened next is one of the most astonishing historical maneuvers of the Tudor era. Elizabeth instructed Davison to hold the warrant, implying she might recall it. However, Cecil and the Privy Council, fearing Elizabeth would change her mind and knowing the risk to the realm, immediately intercepted the warrant. Acting without Elizabeth's explicit permission, they sealed it and dispatched it to Fotheringhay with blazing speed. By forcing the execution, Cecil committed an act of astonishing boldness, treason, but he did it for the perceived survival of the state. He knew Elizabeth could deny responsibility, but he also knew she would never forgive the man who made her directly responsible for Mary's death. Chapter 8. The Crimson Martyrdom. On the evening of February 7, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was informed she would die the next morning. She received the news not with fear, but with serene resolution. The decades of political turmoil, scandal, and imprisonment were finally ending. She spent the night in prayer, distributing her possessions to her loyal household, and writing her final letters. The execution took place in the great hall of Fotheringhay, where a scaffold draped in black had been hastily erected. The 2 earls appointed as witnesses begged Mary, a Catholic, to accept the services of the Protestant Dean of Peterborough, but she calmly refused, holding fast to the faith for which she believed she was dying. Mary was dressed not in the black of mourning, but in a petticoat and sleeves of deep crimson red, the liturgical color of martyrdom in the Catholic Church. It was a final, stunning act of political theater, broadcasting her identity as a religious martyr to all of Europe. The execution itself was a brutal, astonishing spectacle. After her ladies helped her remove her black outer gown, Mary knelt at the block. She forgave the executioner, whispering, "Now I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." The first blow missed her neck, striking the back of her head. A small gasp of pain escaped the queen. The second blow severed the neck, but a sinew remained, requiring the executioner to hack through it with a third. Gruesome stroke. The executioner held up the severed head and proclaimed, "God save the Queen," meaning Elizabeth. In that shocking instant, the head slipped from his grasp. Mary had been wearing an auburn wig. Her own hair, shorn short and gray with age and suffering, was revealed underneath. As a final, astonishing detail, a small Skye terrier named Gideon, Mary's constant companion, was discovered hidden beneath her skirts. It refused to leave her body, staining itself with her blood until it was forcibly removed. All the clothing, the block, and the bloody ground were immediately burned to prevent relics from being taken by Catholic sympathizers. Epilogue: the silence of the Virgin Queen. When the news reached Elizabeth, she staged a dramatic and astonishing performance of shock and rage. She wept hysterically, claiming she had been betrayed and that the Privy Council had acted against her true will. William Davison, the poor secretary who delivered the warrant, was made the scapegoat, thrown into the Tower of London, and fined ruinously. Elizabeth maintained a pretense of innocence, securing plausible deniability to the international community. The execution did achieve its ultimate goal, the removal of the most dangerous threat to the English throne. However, the political fallout was immediate. The Catholic world was outraged, providing King Philip II of Spain with the final justification he needed to launch the Spanish Armada the following year. The war was inevitable, but the greatest threat from within, Mary Stuart, was silenced. Mary's execution proved that Elizabeth was willing to take the ultimate risk for the sake of the Protestant state. The two cousins, who never met face to face, defined their nations by their rivalry. Mary's life was a passionate, tragic rush of disastrous personal decisions. Elizabeth's was a shrewd, calculated, and often lonely political triumph. When Elizabeth I finally died childless in 1603, the throne passed without a single shot fired to the legitimate Protestant successor, James Cunning of Scotland, the son of the cousin she had executed. In a final astonishing twist of fate, Mary, Queen of Scots, had won the dynastic battle, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland in the person of her son, the man who would be known as James I of Great Britain. The blood feud was over, but the dynasty that reigned for the next century owed its existence to the astonishing, tragic life of Mary Stuart. This concludes the complete, astonishing, and brutal story of Mary, Queen of Scots, versus Elizabeth I. Their blood feud ultimately forged the nation we know as Great Britain today. What do you think? Was Elizabeth justified in executing Mary to protect her realm? Or should Mary be remembered purely as an innocent Catholic martyr? Let us know in the comments which part of this historical narrative you found the most astonishing. Want more historical drama? If this battle for the throne, treason, and power grab appealed to you, then you won't want to miss our other video. In that video, we discuss Cleopatra, the Roman throne, and a story of devastating love. This queen is a legend who used her intelligence, beauty, and diplomatic skills to challenge the world's most powerful empire. If you loved this kind of history, don't miss this dramatic story. And if you love this story, please hit the like button and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from history. We can't wait to see you in the next chapter.